We have to just start our discussion of the Inklings about 25 years, 30 years maybe, before the Inklings ever existed. We have to start it with George MacDonald, the author of Phantastes. As a Christian writer, Oswald Chambers said, is a striking indication of the trend and shallowness of the modern reading public that George MacDonald's books have been so neglected. George MacDonald was one of the early writers of fantasy in a time when most people were writing realistic novels. Now, he did write a lot of other realistic novels that don't have as much influence over the Inklings. But these worlds of the fantastical that he created, his understanding of the imagination and the role that it plays in the life of a Christian, the connection between the faith and the supernatural, the draw towards joy and beauty and goodness, the delight in the King Arthur stories, all of these things will have influence over the Inklings later, but they begin here in the 1850s and 60s with the writings of George MacDonald. So, who was George MacDonald and why does his influence matter? Well, Chesterton writes about George MacDonald and says, the commonplace allegory takes what it regards as commonplaces necessary to ordinary people and tries to make them pleasant by dressing them up as princesses and goblins. But George MacDonald really did believe that people were princesses and goblins and good fairies and dressed them up as ordinary people. The fairy tale was the inside of the ordinary story and not the outside. So Chesterton's influence from George MacDonald was that he saw the reality being revealed in the fantastical. Lewis writes something similar when Lewis says, you've never met a mere mortal. That if someone was to take off this guise of ordinariness, what you would see, you would be tempted to worship, because that's what human beings actually are, embodied souls. And yet we have become anesthetized to that way of seeing people with their supernatural meaning or their supernatural reality. But what George MacDonald does is he gives that back to us and reveals that. And Chesterton was delighted by this part of his work. Now, Chesterton, of course, lived at the same time as MacDonald, so they were more closely aligned in visions, but MacDonald had quite an influence over Chesterton's imagination. Of course, he had quite an influence on Lewis's imagination. Lewis writes, I never concealed the fact I regarded him as my master. I fancy I've never written a book in which I did not quote from him, and I think you can see this in all of Lewis's work, that the influence of MacDonald hangs heavy on every single narrative that he writes. And finally, Madeline L'Engle writes, George MacDonald is the grandfather of us all who ever struggle to come to terms with truth through fantasy. And I would say even larger, for those who come to struggle with faith through fantasy. This was something that George MacDonald did differently from anybody who came before. George MacDonald was Scottish. He was born in Aberdeen. And unfortunately, he suffered quite a bit of loss. His mother died when he was young, just as Lewis's mother died when he was young. 2 of his brothers, as well as 3 of his children, died of tuberculosis. And George MacDonald himself also suffered from tuberculosis, from coughs, and from poor health sometimes. He graduated in 1845 with chemistry and physics in his background, but then became a minister. Many people focus on this part of his biography as a failed minister, but other writers and scholars have said this was actually not true. The problem is that this congregation in particular thought he had too much of the German influence on his teaching. So what does that mean, the German influence? People probably nowadays think of the German influence as being, as David Downing says, trains that run on time. What actually the German influence would have looked like would have been the Romantics, the Schleiermachian influence, that each of us are on a journey and we are looking inward in order to discover the emotions and the passions within us that were given to us by God and are drawing us back to God. The German Romantic vision that would have had a heavy influence on MacDonald, and that this congregation was not in line with. But George MacDonald as a preacher was not a failure. He was actually a very inspirational teacher, and he taught for 40 years literature. And when he toured in America in 1872, he was actually offered a $20,000 a year salary in order to be a minister, a pastor there in the U.S., and MacDonald turned it down, preferring to go back home, and actually ended up living in Italy, but wanted to be in Europe, did not want to be in America, and also thought that was an absurd amount of money to pay somebody. But he was not a failed preacher. Just that one congregation, the reasons that he maybe failed there had a lot to do with the ways that he saw theology and the ways that German Romanticism had a strong influence on his understanding of God and the relationship between people and nature and the fantastical. So let's begin with Phantastes. This was probably the most influential text on the Inklings. The opening of Phantastes begins with a rather lengthy epigraph from Novalis, again, German Romantic ideas. The opening of the book talks about dreams, and this is a dream narrative. In that sense, probably Tolkien would have considered it not to be a fairy story because it begins with this frame in which someone has a dream of another world. Novalis writes, "One can imagine stories without rational cohesion, filled with associations like dreams and poems that are merely lovely sounding. This true poesy can have a general allegorical meaning as music does." So not a direct allegory in the same way that Tolkien was turned off, or Lewis was turned off by direct allegory like Pilgrim's Progress, but something like an allegorical meaning, the way music has a meaning in the way that it feels. A fairy story then is like a vision without rational connections, a harmonious whole, a musical fantasia, miraculous, mysterious, interrelated, and alive. So when you read Phantastes, you're reading, in a sense, the music of the spheres. Things are connected by the feelings that they give you, not necessarily the linear progress of the narrative. As a great MacDonald scholar, Stephen Prickett, who is actually one of my teachers, but also was one of C.S. Lewis's students, wrote of MacDonald, that MacDonald was one of the few 19th century writers to recognize that realism and fantasy are two sides of the same coin. That realism is as much an arbitrary convention as fantasy, and that fantasy is as dependent on mundane experience as realism. And I think we see this in the ways that it plays out in Phantastes. Prickett also argues that Phantastes is a Bildungsroman that takes place in fairyland. Now, what is a Bildungsroman? So this was a German conception, a narrative or a novel, roman meaning romance or novel, in which the character goes through a change, a growth, an education novel. This is where someone learns to see the world differently. They grow up, in a sense. And we see this in Phantastes because you have a 21-year-old who at the beginning has inherited his father's estate, and he's received a key from his father that's going to open a chest of drawers, and he's going to see what kind of paperwork reveals who his father was. But what actually happens is this key opens not necessarily to the past, but to another world that changes him for the future. It becomes his education. The experience in fantasies, in fairyland, becomes his education for becoming someone who can run his father's estate. When he begins the narrative, he is enamored with false ideals of what heroism means, but as he progresses, he becomes aware of what actually heroism should look like. His journey then is full of these ironic reversals. As he writes at the end of the narrative, "I set out to find my ideal and came back rejoicing that I had lost my shadow," and we'll kind of unpack what that means. But for him, he was heavily influenced by King Arthur and had this idea of what it meant to be a hero from the King Arthur stories, from the things that he had read. And these ideas affected how he was going to be a hero, and he has to overturn a lot of these different ideas. The structure, as one writer has argued, is more centripetal and centrifugal and less linear. So I think we have to read that as there's a center point and everything kind of spins out and back to the center point. And that's how the narrative moves. The main character is anodos, meaning pathless, right? But it also can mean ascendant, right? Pathless, impassable, and it can mean ascent, to go upwards. As the woman in the cottage says of anodos, he's wandering now without aim, but by the end of the story, because it is a Bildungsroman, he will ascend to a point where he has aim. He is someone who has been descended from fairies, whatever exactly that means. If we remember Chesterton's quote that MacDonald thinks that people really are princesses and goblins, they really are fairies that have been dressed up like ordinary people. That's what we should think of as anodos, that all of us, in a sense, have this fairy character, that we are spirits walking around in bodies. We're embodied spirits. He follows paths at the beginning without any good reason. Like his name, he's pathless. But then he begins to have more and more reasons for the things that he does. He has more and more direction as he goes through story, and he even gains abilities. He no longer just listens to the music around him. He has himself the ability to sing, and he harnesses this as a power. Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson has argued of the effect of the Arthurian legends upon MacDonald, and I think this is important for all of the Inklings to understand that this was fairly new. So Tennyson, of course, has the famous Idylls. This was only published, Phantastes was published 1 year prior to that. So we really should think that this is all in the same time period as Tennyson writing his Arthurian legends. Only a few years after Morte d'Arthur had become popular again in 1814 by this introduction by Robert Southey. Now people are all reading Morte d'Arthur when they hadn't in hundreds of years, and now they're all reading it again as though it's a new book. And this has implications for the way that they view the Arthurian legends. We have Merlin appearing in that hideous strength, the Holy Grail in Charles Williams' narrative. The whole feel of Lord of the Rings is very much Arthur, Merlin being Gandalf, Arthur being Frodo. You have the same kind of feel that you get from the Arthurian stories, and MacDonald is doing that here. As mentioned, Anodos has been influenced by the things that he has read prior to coming into fairyland. So he went in search of fairyland for his ideals, but now that he's in fairyland, he also becomes a reader. And the first things that he does is when he's in the cottage, kind of in that liminal space between our world and fairyland. So he's at the borderland of fairyland. He's about to enter. And what does he read? He reads the stories of Sir Percival and Sir Galahad. He reads the King Arthur stories before he enters the world of fairyland. In the very middle of the narrative, too, he reads stories that tell him how to interpret the world that he's living in. We can understand now why this has such an influence on C.S. Lewis, who then begins to understand that his reading affects his imagination, which affects his desires, which affects his will. So the imagination is the entrance point to how somebody lives their lives. How they imagine themselves, how they see themselves within the story affects how it is that they live. And this is why George MacDonald, as a pastor, began to feel so strongly about the necessity of writing fiction as a way of cultivating the kinds of imaginations in people that would open them up to faithful lives.